Alicia recognized the shape of a slaughter before the first weapon was even drawn. She'd learned to spot it in the subtle shifts of a room, the sudden absence of ambient chatter, the rigid posture of the patrons lingering near the exits, the heavy silence that fell over the casino floor. Tonight, every nerve in her body hummed with the certainty that the Gilded Lily was about to become a graveyard. And the man brooding over his chips at the VIP felt table didn't realize he was already breathing on borrowed time. Duan didn't look like a man at the end of his reign. He looked like a sovereign, entirely at ease, his tailored charcoal suit absorbing the dim amber light of the room as he focused intently on the game in front of him. Linda, his elegant fiancée sitting just to his left, wore a shimmering silver gown that caught the chandeliers and an expression of cool, untouchable grace. To anyone else in the room, they were the pinnacle of power and glamour. They looked invincible. But Alicia had noticed something about Linda exactly 5 minutes ago, something that made her pulse hammer wildly against her ribs. She'd been clearing glasses near the foyer when she saw Linda's delicate, manicured hand slip the heavy deadbolts on the main mahogany doors. The soft, metallic click had echoed in Alicia's mind like a coffin sealing shut. He thinks this is a quiet night at their usual spot, Alicia realized, watching the heavy hitters disguised as diners casually unbutton their jackets. Instead, he's sitting in a cage. The cartel takes over tonight. The realization had left Alicia cold, knowing she was watching an execution being staged in real time. Now she leaned over the green velvet of the betting table under the guise of collecting his glass, her eyes catching the gleam of suppressed weapons in the shadows, a rusted skeleton key pressed securely against her palm.
The air inside the Gilded Lily always smelled of expensive bourbon and old money, but tonight it carried the faint, metallic tang of adrenaline. Alicia balanced her silver tray, her sensible black flats making no sound against the thick Persian carpets. She was invisible, just another piece of the high-end decor, which was exactly why she saw everything. It had started near the coat check just minutes earlier. Alicia had been wiping down a nearby cocktail table when Linda excused herself from Doan's side, supposedly to powder her nose. Only Linda hadn't gone toward the gilded arches of the restrooms. She had drifted toward the grand foyer. Alicia had watched from the periphery of her vision as the Mafia boss's elegant fiancé paused by the heavy mahogany entrance. Linda's gaze flicked left, then right, checking the sightlines. It was a predator's calculation. Then, with a smooth, fluid motion hidden by the drape of her shimmering silver gown, Linda's manicured fingers found the brass deadbolts. Snick. The sound was impossibly soft, swallowed by the jazz trio playing in the corner, but to Alicia, it was deafening. The front doors didn't just close, they clicked with the sound of a coffin sealing shut. Linda turned back, her magazine cover smile perfectly back in place, and glided to the VIP table where Doan sat brooding over his chips. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Alicia's veins. Why lock the doors from the inside during peak hours? She forced herself to keep moving, pretending to clear empty glasses while her eyes frantically scanned the dimly lit casino floor. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The 4 men at the nearby baccarat table hadn't placed a bet in 20 minutes. Their eyes were fixed entirely on Doan's broad shoulders. The sommelier, a man Alicia didn't recognize from the regular rotation, was standing too close to the service corridor, his hand resting unnaturally stiffly inside his tuxedo jacket. They weren't patrons, they were a cleanup crew. Alicia's breath hitched as one of the men at the baccarat table slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket. Beneath the lapel, the matte black cylinder of a suppressed weapon caught a sliver of amber light. They were moving into position, waiting for a silent signal. Doan was a dead man, His empire, his life, everything was about to end in a bloodbath on the velvet floors of the Lily, and he was completely oblivious, studying his cards while the architect of his demise sat beside him, smelling of expensive perfume and betrayal. Every survival instinct told Alicia to run, to slip out the back and let the underworld consume itself. But she couldn't let a man be slaughtered in the dark. She knew the layout of this building better than the architects, and she knew the one thing Linda had forgotten: the old basement tunnels. Her hand slipped into her apron pocket, her fingers closing tightly around the cold, rusted brass of the master service key. Taking a steadying breath, Alicia altered her path, stepping directly toward the crossfire.
Alicia's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her hands, the hands of a woman who had spent years becoming invisible to men of power, remained steady. She stepped into the circle of amber light surrounding the VIP table. Linda was laughing at something Do-won had said, a bright, melodic sound that felt like a razor blade against Alicia's skin. The hitmen were inches from drawing. Alicia didn't have seconds. She had heartbeats. As she reached to clear a half-empty glass of bourbon near Do-won's elbow, she intentionally let her wrist catch the edge of his sleeve. The dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine green velvet of the table and pooling near his stacks of high-value chips. "Oh, I am so sorry, sir," Alicia gasped, the pitch of her voice perfectly calibrated to sound like a terrified server who had just made a career-ending mistake. Linda's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flashed with a cold, sharp annoyance. Do-won stiffened, his gaze snapping to Alicia with the sudden, lethal intensity of a predator interrupted. "Watch yourself," he growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the very air in the room grow heavy. Alicia didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in closer, ostensibly to dab at the spill with a white linen napkin. Under the shroud of the cloth and the edge of the table, her hand found his. Her fingers were small against his calloused palm, but the weight of the rusted skeleton key she pressed into his grip was undeniable. She felt his muscles lock, a silent, violent question forming in the way his fingers instinctively curled around the cold metal. "Don't look at the doors," she whispered, her breath ghosting against his ear as she leaned lower to clean the spill. "Linda locked the front 5 minutes ago. The men at the baccarat table are reaching. Use the service entrance. The key in your hand is the only way out." For a fraction of a second, the world narrowed down to the two of them. Do-won's eyes didn't flicker toward the door or the gunman. He kept them fixed on Alicia. In that look, the invisible waitress was suddenly the most visible person in his world. He didn't ask how she knew, and he didn't hesitate. The subtle shift in his posture was instantaneous. The relaxed sovereign was gone, replaced by a man prepared for war. "It's all right," Do-won said aloud, his voice projecting just enough for the room to hear. He reached into his pocket as if for a tip, his fingers actually securing the key Alicia had gifted him. Accidents happen. He looked at Linda, his expression a mask of perfect, murderous composure. Alicia backed away, her tray trembling now that the message was delivered. She had lit the fuse. The click of the lock was about to be met with the roar of a reclaimed empire. The lights didn't just flicker, they died with a violent finality that swallowed the gilded Lily whole. In the heartbeat of absolute silence that followed, the first shot rang out, a muffled, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of suppressed gunfire, shredding the expensive upholstery where Do-won had been sitting a second before. Alicia didn't wait for the screams to start. She reached through the suffocating dark, her fingers locking on to the rough wool of Do-won's sleeve. "This way," she hissed, her voice a jagged wire of urgency. She felt him move with her, a heavy, lethal shadow in the gloom. They drifted toward the service corridor, guided by her muscle memory of 1,000 double shifts. Behind them, the dining room erupted into a chaos of overturned tables and the frantic shouting of men realizing their target had vanished.
A stray bullet shattered a rack of crystal nearby, the shards raining down like diamonds in the dark. They burst through the heavy steel service door and into the belly of the building. Here, the air was thick with the smell of grease and the rhythmic, industrial heartbeat of the boiler room. Alicia led him down a narrow iron staircase that groaned under their weight, descending into a labyrinth of rusted steam pipes and low-hanging conduits. "Stay low," she warned as they hit the concrete floor. The basement was a forest of shadows, lit only by the rhythmic amber pulse of emergency status lights. A heavy crash echoed from the stairs above. The service door had been kicked open. Linda's mercenaries weren't far behind, their tactical flashlights cutting through the gloom like searchlights. Alicia didn't stop to look back. She ducked under a hissing pipe, the scalding vapor dampening her hair, and pulled Dewan deeper into the maze. Gunfire barked again, the sound echoing off the narrow brick walls with deafening force. Sparks flew as a bullet struck a copper line 3 feet to their left, sending a plume of blinding white steam screaming into the air. Dewan didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight, his hand finding the rusted skeleton key in his pocket as if it were a talisman. "The tunnel is behind the main furnace," whispered Alicia, her chest heaving as they pressed themselves against a damp wall to let a sweep of light pass over them. For the first time in her life, her invisibility felt like armor. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a ghost leading a king through the underworld. Behind them, the boots of the cleanup crew pounded against the iron grates, closing the gap. They were being hunted in the dark, and the only way out was forward, into the cold, silent depths where the gilded lily kept its secrets. The iron door at the end of the tunnel groaned as Dewan heaved it open, the sound echoing like a dying gasp. They stumbled out into the biting chill of the night, the city's industrial outskirts, a stark, jagged contrast to the velvet opulence they had left behind. Alicia's lungs burned, each breath a ragged victory against the lingering taste of steam and gun smoke. "My apartment," she panted, gesturing toward a cluster of brick low-rises 3 blocks away. "It's close. We can disappear there. Call your people. Find out who is still loyal." Dewan didn't argue. He moved with a predatory grace that even exhaustion couldn't dull, his hand still closed tightly around the skeleton key as if it were the only anchor left in a world that had just capsized. They moved through the shadows, 2 ghosts slipping between parked cars and overflowing dumpsters. Alicia felt a flicker of hope as her building came into view, the familiar cracked pavement, the flickering street lamp, the sanctuary of her 4th-floor walk-up. But as they rounded the final corner, that hope was extinguished by a sea of strobe lights. The street was a neon-lit nightmare. Flashing sirens painted the brickwork in rhythmic, violent pulses of red and blue. Half a dozen black SUVs sat idling at the curb, their doors flung open like the wings of carrion birds. Alicia froze, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. Her window, the one with the small pot of ivy she'd tended for years, was being shattered by men in heavy tactical gear. A news van was parked nearby, its satellite dish aimed at the dark sky like a spear. On a monitor visible through the van's side window, Alicia saw her own face, a grainy, smiling employee ID photo from the Gilded Lily. Below it, the scrolling ticker read, "Breaking, nationwide manhunt for waitress Alicia Thorne, primary suspect in the armed kidnapping of Dewan." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Linda hadn't just tried to kill him, she had scripted the aftermath. In the eyes of the law and the public, Alicia wasn't the savior who had handed over a key. She was the traitor who had lured a sovereign into a trap. Every exit was blocked, every bridge back to her old life reduced to ash. "She burned it," Alicia whispered, her voice hollow and trembling. "She burned my whole life in 5 minutes." She felt a heavy, warm hand settle on her shoulder. Dewan was looking at the carnage of her reputation with a grim, knowing shadow in his eyes. He didn't offer empty comforts, he simply turned her away from the lights. The waitress was dead, the fugitive was all that remained, and in the cold silence of the alleyway, Alicia realized that the only person left in the world who knew the truth was the man whose life she had just saved.
The stronghold didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage waiting for the lid to drop. Tucked behind the rusted facade of a waterfront warehouse, the interior was a stark, brutalist landscape of polished concrete and flickering monitors. The air here was colder than the night outside, smelling of gun oil and the ozone of high-end servers. Doo-won moved through the space with the heavy, calculated stride of a wounded king returning to a crumbling throne. His men, dozens of them in tactical gear, snapped to attention as they entered, but Alicia felt the shift in the room immediately. It was the same prickle at the base of her neck she'd felt at the Gilded Lily. She stayed 2 steps behind him, her oversized coat, borrowed from a stash in the car, swallowing her frame. To the guards, she was a liability, a stray he'd dragged in from the rain. They didn't realize that a waitress's entire life was built on noticing the things people tried to hide. Status, Doo-won barked at a man with a jagged scar across his temple. The perimeter is secure, boss. We've locked down the digital grid. No one gets in or out without a biometric signature. The man's voice was steady, but Alicia watched his hands. He was thumbing the safety of his holster with a rhythmic, nervous twitch, a tell she'd seen 1,000 times at the poker tables when a player was bluffing a losing hand. Her gaze drifted to the comm station. 2 technicians were huddled over a screen, their shoulders tight, their eyes darting toward the exit every time a door hissed open. In the corner, a lieutenant was checking his watch with a frequency that suggested he was counting down to an appointment, not just monitoring the time. The click wasn't just at the restaurant, it was here, too. Doo-won, Alicia whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. He paused, turning his head just enough to acknowledge her. The exhaustion in his eyes was a physical weight, but the sharpness remained. Not now, Alicia. Look at them, she urged, her heart beginning that familiar, frantic staccato. The man by the door, his stance is mirrored toward the hallway, not the entrance. The technicians aren't coding, they're deleting logs. They aren't waiting for your orders, they're waiting for a signal. Doo-won's gaze swept the room, slower this time, filtering the scene through the lens she had provided. He saw the subtle misalignments, the fractured loyalties hidden behind masks of discipline. The silence in the room grew heavy, a suffocating pressure that made the air hard to breathe. In that moment, the terrifying truth settled between them. The Moretti Empire hadn't just been attacked, it had been hollowed out from the inside. Linda hadn't just locked the front doors of a restaurant, she had locked the doors of his entire world. In a fortress filled with soldiers, the only person Doo-won could trust was the woman who had spilled bourbon on his sleeve to save his life. The blue light of the terminal screen washed over Alicia's face, casting long, skeletal shadows against the cold concrete wall. Beside her, Do-won stood like a silent monolith, his presence a heavy, grounding weight in the sterile glow of the command center. He had given her access to the mainframe, his trust a gamble that could either save his life or end it. "I'm not a coder," Alicia whispered, her fingers hovering over the keys. "But I know the rhythm of the Lily. I know who sat where, who tipped in cash, and who never looked the staff in the eye." She pulled up the restaurant's encrypted reservation logs from the last 6 months. On the adjacent screen, she opened the cartel's internal security rosters, the names of the men currently patrolling the hallways outside. To anyone else, it was just a sea of data. To Alicia, it was a map of betrayal. She began to cross-reference. Every time a Mr. Smith booked the corner booth, the one with the blind spot for the cameras, a specific shift change happened here at the stronghold. She tracked the dates. May 14th, a high-stakes meeting at the Lily and 3 of Do-won's top lieutenants were indisposed. June 2nd, a shipment of untraceable currency moved through the docks. The same night, Linda had insisted on a private tasting in the cellar.
The patterns began to emerge, glowing in the dark like radioactive ink. It wasn't just a few men, it was a network. "There," Alicia said, her voice trembling as she highlighted a string of names. "The men guarding the armory right now, they've all had private dinners hosted by Linda over the last year. They aren't your soldiers anymore, Do-won. They're her assets." She felt him lean in, his breath catching as the scope of the infiltration became undeniable. The invisible Waitress had found the rot that his best intelligence officers had missed. She wasn't just reading logs, she was reading the ghosts of conversations, the echoes of deals made in the shadows of the restaurant she had served for years. The machine didn't lie. Linda hadn't just planned an assassination, she had been meticulously dismantling Do-won's empire, one reservation at a time. Alicia looked up at him, the gravity of their isolation settling over them. They weren't just in a stronghold, they were in a hive, and the queen was about to signal the swarm. Do-won's hand tightened on the back of her chair, his knuckles white. The ghost in the machine had spoken, and the truth was more terrifying than the bullets they had escaped.
The screen flickered to life in the dim command center, casting a cold, flickering blue light over the room. Linda stood behind a podium draped in black, her silhouette a study in curated grief. Gone was the shimmering silver gown. In its place was a modest charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a soft, vulnerable style that screamed victim. "I just want him back," Linda sobbed, the sound perfectly pitched for the microphones. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, the same hands that had locked the deadbolt at the Gilded Lily. "Alicia Thorne wasn't just an employee. We trusted her. We cared for her. To think she could lead those men to him? To kidnap my Do-han for a ransom?" She paused, looking directly into the camera, her eyes hardening beneath the moisture. "I am offering a reward of $5 million for information leading to the capture of Alicia Thorne. Please, bring this monster to justice before she hurts him." Alicia watched the broadcast in a stunned, hollow silence. On the screen, her own face stared back, the harmless, smiling employee photo. But now that face was a target. The city she had lived in her entire life was being turned into a hunting ground, and she was the prize. "She's good," Do-han said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble behind her. "She's turned the world into your enemy." Alicia didn't look away from the screen. She felt the weight of the bounty like a physical pressure against her chest. She couldn't be Alicia Thorne anymore, not if she wanted to survive, not if she wanted to win. She walked to the small kitchenette in the back of the stronghold and found a pair of heavy industrial shears. In the cracked mirror above the sink, she caught her reflection. She took a breath, the metallic scent of the stronghold filling her lungs, and gripped a handful of her hair. Snip. The first lock fell to the concrete floor, followed by another and another. She watched her old self vanish in jagged, uneven layers until her hair was a sharp, aggressive crop that shadowed her eyes. She reached for a bottle of dark industrial dye from a nearby supply shelf, smearing the chemicals into the strands until the warm chestnut glow was replaced by a flat obsidian black. She stripped off the borrowed coat and pulled on a structured, dark tactical blazer she found in the armory. When she stepped back into the light of the command center, Do-han didn't see a waitress. He saw a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows. The socialite had her mask. Now Alicia had her armor. "The waitress is dead," she said, her voice steady and cold as the steel around them. "Let's find out what's left." The air inside the cartel's glass and steel headquarters didn't smell like the Gilded Lily. It smelled of ozone, cold ambition, and the floral perfume Linda favored. Alicia adjusted the headset resting against her sharp obsidian black crop, the clip-on badge identifying her as Elena, event lead, pinned firmly to her dark blazer. In her hand, she clutched a digital tablet, its screen glowing with floor plans for the victory gala Linda was throwing for herself. She was walking back into the mouth of the beast, but this time she wasn't carrying a tray of bourbon. Hidden in the lining of her cuff was a bypass chip the size of a fingernail, the only thing that could bridge the gap between Do-won's exile and his reclamation. "The centerpieces go in the east wing," Alicia directed, her voice pitched with the clipped, harried authority of a high-end coordinator. She didn't look at the guards as she passed. She knew from the reservation logs she'd decoded that these two were on Linda's private payroll. She kept her gaze fixed on the tablet, her heart a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of purpose. The server room sat behind a reinforced biometric door on the penthouse level, just steps away from where Linda was currently holding court with her grieving allies. Alicia moved through the frantic hum of caterers and florists, a ghost in a sea of activity. When she reached the security alcove, she didn't hesitate. She used a pre-programmed frequency on her tablet, a gift from Do-won's remaining loyalists, to create a 3-second loop in the corridor's camera feed. Click. The server room door hissed open. The interior was a cathedral of blinking blue lights and freezing air. Alicia moved to the central hub, her fingers flying over the cables until she found the primary uplink. With a hand that remained terrifyingly steady, she slotted the bypass chip into the port. A single green light bloomed on the console, a silent signal that the fortress's digital walls were no longer impenetrable. "Elena?" The voice was like a whip crack. Alicia froze, her hand still hovering over the server. She turned slowly, her new, jagged reflection caught in the polished glass of the server racks. Linda stood in the doorway, the light from the hallway silhouetting her perfect, predatory form. Her socialite's mask was still on, but her eyes were searching, suspicious. "The linens for the head table, ma'am. I was told the inventory logs were kept on the secure server. I wanted to ensure everything was perfect for your big night." Linda stepped into the room, the scent of her perfume clashing with the cold ozone. She studied Alicia's new face, her eyes narrowing as she looked for a trace of the waitress she had framed. For a heartbeat, the world hung in the balance. Then Linda smiled, a cold, triumphant curve of the lips. "Carry on, then," Linda murmured, turning back toward the gala. "Everything must be perfect. After tonight, there will be no looking back." Alicia watched her go, the green light of the bypass chip reflected in her dark eyes. Linda was right. After tonight, there would be no looking back for either of them. The final shift had begun.
The ballroom of the cartel's headquarters was a cathedral of glass and gold, vibrating with the low hum of power. At the center of the dais, Linda stood like a conquering queen, her charcoal suit replaced by a gown of midnight velvet. She raised a crystal flute, her voice amplified through the hidden speakers Alicia had spent the last hour subverting. "Tonight, we close a tragic chapter," Linda announced, her eyes glistening with practiced sorrow. "With Do-won gone, we stand united, for the Empire, for the future." As the crowd raised their glasses, the grand holographic displays surrounding the room flickered. It wasn't the memorial tribute Linda had prepared. Instead, the polished surfaces erupted into a mosaic of digital ghosts. A recording played, the audio crisp and undeniable. It was Linda's voice, cold and stripped of its socialite's mask, detailing the coordinates of Do-won's assassination to a rival cartel leader. Then came the reservation logs, highlighted in neon red, showing the systematic placement of moles across every secure wing of the organization. Finally, a grainy, high-definition feed from the Gilded Lily, Linda, her manicured fingers sliding the deadbolt into place while Do-won sat oblivious just yards away. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Linda's glass shattered against the marble floor, the sound a sharp, jagged echo of the click that had started it all. "Traitors!" a voice rumbled from the back of the hall. The heavy double doors swung open. Do-won stepped into the light, no longer a ghost, but a sovereign returned to reclaim his throne. His presence was a physical weight, crushing the budding rebellion before a single shot could be fired.
His loyalists, guided by the bypass Alicia had planted, surged into the room, disarming the moles with surgical precision. Linda didn't scream, she simply collapsed inward, the mask finally shattered beyond repair as she was led away into the shadows of the very basement she had tried to make his grave. In the aftermath, the ballroom was stripped of its finery, leaving only the cold, functional reality of a war room. Do-won stood at the central console, looking out over the city he once again owned. He turned to Alicia. She still wore the dark blazer and the jagged obsidian hair, the look of someone who had survived the end of the world and come back with the keys to the kingdom. "You saw the pattern when I was blind," Do-won said, his voice low and resonant. He reached out, not for a glass or a chip, but to hand her a sleek, encrypted tablet, the digital heart of his entire operation. "My soldiers can hold the streets, but I need someone who can see through the walls. The intelligence network is yours, Alicia. Every shadow, every secret, every invisible detail. From this moment on, you are the architect of this empire's survival." Alicia took the device, her fingers steady as she looked into the eyes of the man she had saved. The waitress was gone. The strategist had arrived.
The invisible waitress has finally become the architect of an empire. But in a world built on secrets, even a strategist has to watch her back. If you enjoyed this journey from the Gilded Lily to the heart of the underworld, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of Alicia and Do-won's rise to power. We're building a global network of our own. Drop a comment below and let us know which corner of the world you're watching from. Until next time, keep your eyes on the details. The most dangerous people are the ones you never see coming.